I've traveled a lot this month. For much of the time when I was working on the first two vlogs, I was in South Carolina for some family responsibilities. And then this past weekend, I was also out of town, this time for another special bookish adventure, an amazing booktuber meetup. MJ from Reading This Life and Greg from Another Bibliophile Reads, along with his wonderful bookish wife, and I celebrated the annual Bookstore Crawl in Philadelphia. Initially, there was a possibility that a couple of other booktubers were going to be joining us as well, and I'm really sorry that didn't work out. But we've already mentioned the possibility of making some kind of gathering a more regular event. Although I took a lot of video at the bookstores we visited, I'm afraid I didn't take much of Booktubers, mostly because I was so busy looking at the books. I'll show you a few of the stores we visited, and perhaps talk about a few of the books that intrigued me there, but I think I'm going to hold off on my full haul until a future video. I may show you one book. I want to tell you about the latter part of my trip first, and then I'll get back to the stores in downtown Philadelphia that I visited with MJ, Greg, and his spouse. This was kind of a special weekend for me. I was marking what would have been my wedding anniversary with David, if he had not died last year. Although we met in North Carolina, we fell in love in Philadelphia, so he was on my mind even more than usual. And after a wonderful evening on Friday, and morning and early afternoon on Saturday with the Booktuber crew, I peeled off and headed for West Philadelphia, where David and I lived. I had a few hours until I was meeting up with a very old friend of ours, a person who signed our ketubah, our Jewish wedding document. And during those free hours, I visited some of the old haunts David and I used to love, including the Button, the sculpture in front of the library where David joined me and my history grad student friends almost every day for lunch as we ate our sandwiches, both before we were dating and afterwards. Then I stopped by the bookstore that I considered my regular way back when. The shop was only a block away from my apartment, and it was on the path I took as I walked to and from my academic department. What an amazing visit I had there this time. A house of our own has been in Philadelphia for 50 years, and it's located in an old house, a row house, looking more or less just like all the rest of the row houses on the street, many of which are chopped up into student apartments or have become homes for undergraduate fraternities, etc. The current owners are the original owners of the store, the founders of the store, Debbie and her husband, Greg. I think Debbie had just graduated from college when they started the bookshop, and it has been a haven for both activists and scholars ever since. I had not been in the store for nearly 30 years. I climbed the front steps with my big backpack full of both books and my clothes for the weekend, and asked the older woman at the desk if I could leave my bag there as I browsed. She looked at me and furrowed her brows. "Sure, you've been here before, haven't you? Yes?" "Well, yes, but it's been 30 years. I was a grad student in history, I lived down the street, and I stopped in the store a couple of times a week on my way home." Yes, I recognized you. What's your name?" And then she added, "It was kind of unusual back then for someone your age, as I remember it." "Hannah," I said. "When I was young, everyone had a grandmother or a great aunt named Hannah. And now everyone has a daughter or a niece named Hannah, but there are not many Hannahs my age." Of course, the woman behind the counter was Debbie, one of the owners. There were people in the checkout line, and I was eager to browse, not really believing that she could possibly remember me. The store was absolutely packed with books, but they all seemed to be carefully tended to. There was no smell of book mold or anything like that, as there was in some of the other used bookstores we visited during the bookstore crawl. I spent quite a bit of time walking through the various rooms, upstairs and down, and then took my stack to check out. Debbie was still there, and I told her how much I had loved, and still loved, the store. I mentioned that I had just been visiting a friend in Boston, and whenever I am up there, we visit the Brattle Bookshop, which has the same kind of feel, a place where serious readers are going to immediately feel at home. And she gave me this megawatt smile and told me she started school in Boston at the Conservatory for Classical Music. But after a bit, she realized she wanted a broader liberal arts education. I'm not sure if she said she began to realize it because of the time she spent at the Brattle, or if the Brattle was her refuge for those ideas once she became aware of them. But at any rate, she'd recognized the magic of the Brattle, just as I had recognized the magic of House of Our Own back when I was a student. She started to ring up my handwritten bill and noticed the last name on my credit card. Joyner. Have you written a book? I don't think I've run across it. The only Joyner I remember was black, and I've collected and sold his books a few times. In fact, I recommended his books to a young black man interested in history and culture who was about to move south. I interjected, "That's my father." I didn't explain that my father was a white Southerner who had become interested in the languages and cultures of West Africans, people who were from what was sometimes called the Rice Coast, who had been enslaved to work on plantations in coastal South Carolina where the major crop was rice. The culture they developed in South Carolina had clear links to some of the various cultures of West Africa, and plantation owners relied on their knowledge and experience with rice cultivation. Anyway, I went on to tell her that while I didn't see a copy of Down by the Riverside upstairs, I did see a copy of another book for which Dad had written an introduction. I have never known someone with quite as prodigious a memory as Debbie seems to have, for not only books, but for people, including people who've gone from an age of mid-20s to the age of late 50s. Pretty amazing. Here's just a little footage to give you a sense of the bookshop. If you aren't interested in peeking at the kinds of books they stock at House of Our Own, please feel free to jump to the next section where I'll talk about getting together with Booktubers and about the shops we visited together. So I headed to Philadelphia, and MJ, Greg, his wife, and I met up for dinner. I'd met Greg once before on the National Mall with Alan of Big Hard Books and Classics, who was visiting the East Coast. But I'd not met his wife, nor had I ever met MJ. It was amazing to get to know them all better. The restaurant we were hoping to go to was absolutely packed to the gills, all the way up to closing time. So we found a great Thai restaurant around the corner that was fairly quiet as well. We all enjoyed our meals and then decided to see if any of the bookstores in the area were still open. And although most of the downtown spots seemed to have already closed, we headed to explore the quirky used book emporium called Mostly Books. Like House of Our Own, Mostly Books is jam-packed with a wild assortment of books, but it was also filled with random curiosities and occasionally just straight-out trash. I don't mean trashy books, things that might have qualified for Garb August, but non-bookish refuse, just stuffed in corners. I'm a person with allergies, and the smell of both book mold and stale pot was a bit much for me. Nevertheless, the contents of the store was fascinating. After seeing bins of CDs and VHS tapes in the front, I didn't have especially high hopes. But there were rooms that went on, and there was an upstairs section as well, filled with everything from vintage mass market books to a huge art book collection, from Black American fiction to a section labeled Early Man, from a section full of books about cancer to a collection specifically about parish management. One shelf for love, with its neighbor, advice, etc., etc., etc. One last little shelf, giving you an idea of the breadth of books displayed. Staff picks, which included a book by my academic advisor, a mystery written for young girls that was part of a series my mother read back in the late 1940s and early 1950s, a book about a rock and roll star who, after a, quote, disastrous drug trip with Satan, found religion, and lastly, a translation of a classic work of Japanese literature that was written more than 1,000 years ago. The next morning, the other booktubers and I gathered for our morning beverages of choice and chatted together until the bookstores started opening for the day. The first one we visited was my top choice, Giovanni's room, a feminist and LGBTQ-oriented bookstore, one that claims to be the oldest gay bookstore in the country, opened in 1971 or so, that I used to visit when I was living in Philadelphia all those years ago. More recently, the owner died, and the bookstore was bought by an organization that runs Philly AIDS Thrift. There have been some changes since AIDS Thrift took it over. In addition to books old and new, the store now sells more geegaws and clothing. For example, if you're in the market for a full-length fur coat, this is the place to go. As I was poking around their used books, I was thrilled to run across these 3 volumes. For those of you thinking about joining us for the Proust read-along in 2025, this edition is what I first knew, looking at the set high on my mother's shelves and having her tell me to wait until I was older to give them a try. I don't think she meant to wait this long. I don't think I will actually be reading this translation either, but more on all that, perhaps in December. Back in the day, my friend Mark was the first person to introduce me to Giovanni's room, and I thought it was only appropriate that I bought his book, City of Sisterly and Brotherly Love, Lesbian and Gay Philadelphia, 1945 to 1972, while I was there. For those of you who don't get the title, Philadelphia has long been called the City of Brotherly Love, not in a reference to sexuality, but to an idea of unity. Anyway, I read this fantastic book when it first came out, but I was too broke back then to actually buy my own copy of yet another expensive university press book, when all my academic friends were also in the midst of cranking them out. So when I checked out, the attendant gushed, "This book is fabulous!" And I told her I agreed, and that the author was the person who initially introduced me to Giovanni's room. When she handed me my book, it was in a little tote/backpack they were giving out to customers who spent more than $10 or something at Giovanni's room that day, that says, "Hot people read books." Well, by the end of the day, full of more than 20,000 steps, taken in blaring sunshine and not insignificant humidity while carrying a bunch of hardbacks, hot definitely applied to me. Outside, we poked through tables of very inexpensive books. Buy one, get one free, with books tagged as only 99 cents. And I loved these decorations, these yarn bombings, as they are sometimes called, that were set up right outside the store. After Giovanni's room, we booktubers went to a little bookstore called Garland of Letters, which had narrow aisles absolutely packed with shoppers interested in New Age, yoga, etc. books, and other kinds of items. I especially liked this little shelf of gardening books. Then on to HannahsBooks, a lovely store focusing mostly on contemporary releases. In this display of front-facing nonfiction works, I was intrigued with Frostbite, a book about how refrigeration affected both American culture and climate change, and A Paradise of Small Houses, comparing different styles of affordable housing that developed in America's urban areas. I'm pretty sure I'll be checking both of these books out of my local library and at least poking through them a bit more seriously. I loved some of the store's decorations, from these literary posters high above the shelves to the phrenology paraphernalia scattered around the store. And I loved these enameled pens, too. MJ, Greg, and I spent quite a bit of time in the wonderful Book Trader bookshop, too. It also was packed with used books, lovingly stuffed in every corner of every room on 2 floors. Tons of art, history of all sorts that went on and on. Several full-size bookcases stuffed with books about sports. A huge biography section with everything from a 1-volume biography of mystery writer Rex Stout to a multi-volume biography of Henry James. From a 1-volume collection of the letters of the Southern writer Thomas Wolfe and another of the letters of P.G. Wodehouse, to a couple of sets of the 11-volume diary of Samuel Pepys. Yes, I contemplated sending the latter to Steve Donahue, but I figured if the brattle hasn't provided yet, it will soon. Actually, my very favorite find in this bookstore was this old battered copy of Catcher in the Rye with this long school library checkout record in the front. It isn't my favorite book by any means, but I love this record of student reading. And of course, the volume made me think of Pat at Book Chat with Pat. Well, it was a pretty amazing time in Philadelphia. It was fantastic to get to spend some time with Greg and MJ, and I encourage you to go check out their videos, which I think they're posting at the same time I'm going to post this little vlog. And actually, I did a couple of other things while I was in Philadelphia. I went to both an incredibly interesting museum and a special little bookstore across the street from the museum on the first day in the hours before Greg and MJ arrived in town. I'm going to save that footage to share with you during Framed in September, the upcoming art readathon. So thank you so much for joining me for this video today. There is still more Boston, and I'll try to get those vlogs out before too long. Take care. See you soon here on Hannah's Books.